pledge of allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance
to the flag
to the
of the
flag
United States of
of
America
the United States of America and to the republic
for which it
which
stands,
stands
one
nation
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty
liberty
and
and
justice
justice
for
for all. Tonight, before we begin, I just want to mention that the New York State School Boards Association on-board publication from this week, March 22nd, their above the fold lead article was District Clerks Rise to Challenges of Remote Meetings. And I just wanted to mention that Jane Dawson does an extraordinary job for all of us. She supports us, and she supports our superintendent, and she is such a steady force in our lives. And that article made me think of you, and we are just, again, grateful for all the work you do, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Jane.
Here, thank you, Jane.
All right, I will take a motion to go into an open session of the budget meeting. Open session, Mrs. Nordalillo, and a second, Mr. Vondell, all in favor? Thank you very much. I would like to again note that Mrs. Nordalillo and Mr. Vondell are co-chairs of our budget committee. And I will also mention that Mr. Vondell is going to be handling the meeting tonight. So there you go on that. And Mr. Kaur, would you like to say anything before this meeting, or should we go right to the heart of the matter?
Well, I think it's probably best that we quickly go to very briefly about that agenda and then turn it over to Ms. Skeels, who will start with the lead item on that agenda.
Sorry, it takes a second to load. There you go.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Skeels. Okay, so tonight, we stress that tonight is a very important night. So Ms. Skeels will be here to talk about enrollment, and then we will go to new programs and initiatives. And so for tonight, as you can see, we have the Bridges program, the Director of Social Emotional Learning, and Middle School Innovation as new programs and initiatives. And that particular program will be presented on the 29th of March. That's March 29th. But first of all, and the Bridges program will be presented by Ms. Muldoon, who is our Director of English Language Learning and of languages other than English. So in any case, Ms. Skeels, why don't you start right in? Just remind our audience here that, of course, if you have questions, you can look at the bottom there. You can email them to communications@ncolony.org. So Ms. Skeels, I will turn it over to you, and you can speak to enrollment trends and staffing needs.
Certainly. Okay, so we are starting with a few assumptions. I'm sure everybody's now aware that the CDC has come out with some new guidance for schools. And part of that guidance talks about 3-foot social distancing for students in K-6. And that is regardless of what the transmission rate of the virus is in your community, and 3 feet of social distancing for students in 7 through 12, as long as the region is not considered a high transmission zone. And both of them are dependent on the fact that masks are mandatory. So we know in North Colony, masks have been mandatory since we reopened last year. So for us, that's not a problem. That's not a hurdle. What is currently our hurdle is the fact that by the CDC, this region is still considered a high transmission zone. So if the state were to adopt these guidelines, and let's be clear, the state has not adopted these guidelines yet. And so we are under New York State guidance, which still says 6 feet. If the state were to adopt these guidelines, we would still have to look at the transmission rate for 7 through 12. And as of right now, we would be disqualified from using 3 feet social distancing because according to the CDC, we're in a high transmission rate. So we're not looking right September, the state adopts CDC guidelines, assuming that we're not in a high transmission zone and people are continuing to do all the right things with social distancing and mask wearing, and more people are vaccinated. hopefully transmission will continue to decline. So our plan is to open in September in our new configuration, which was going to happen this year pre-pandemic, which would be our elementary neighborhood schools will now be K through 5. Our middle school will be 6 through 8, and our high school would be 9 through 12. So we would reopen in that configuration. All students would get to come to school every day for a full day. The hybrid model would go away for our secondary school students. If it turns out that we reopen because all these things are in place, and let's say, you know, after Thanksgiving next year, there's a bump in cases like there was this year, and suddenly we're in a high transmission zone, what we would do is for our 7th through 12th grade students, at that point or any point when we're in a high transmission zone, we would have to put them on an alternating schedule. So if they were in a class of 28, half the class comes in on Monday, the other half comes in on Tuesday. So they do one day in school, one day remote, but they would still have a full school day. Schedules wouldn't change, classes wouldn't change, teachers wouldn't change. So thinking about next year, one of the things we always talk about is enrollment, and everything is a little bit more challenging in the pandemic. So the chart below shows the amount of students we have. Obviously, we don't have a K-5 configuration this year, but to compare for next year, currently we have 2,567 students. This was as of March 5th enrollment report. And next year we're projecting 2,585 in K-5. 6-8, currently we have 1,355 students. Next year we're projecting 1,420 students. And 9-12, currently we have 2,010 students. Next year we're projecting 2,005 students. So I want to take a minute and just remind people that in 2017, we had a demography study and we had our district demographics looked at. And it's very interesting because one of the things that the demographer had said was you're seeing a surge in enrollment, but he expected it to sort of plateau and even out. And so what he said in our updates is you're experiencing the boom of it right now in your elementary. And I think what's interesting is if you look at this chart, you can see, yes, it's going to grow from 2567 to 2585. That's not all that much. The junior high, soon to be middle school, going from 1355 to 1420 is much greater. And that is a result of those bigger classes at the upper end of the elementary transitioning now into the middle school while the elementary starts to stabilize. So he predicted this in 2017. We'll look at some of his numbers, but we see very clearly that what Dr. McGibbon projected from us has actually really come true in very real cases. If you've been longtime board members or you've been longtime board budget committee members, you'll know that Mr. Zotner, who used to work for the district and is now happily retired, also did some of his own enrollment forecasting. So he's now happily retired. So we are working on a new model for enrollment forecasting. So let me share this with you, starting with K-5. So K-5 in the first column here, I have the current class enrollment for the 2021 school year. So we have 403 kindergartners, 418 first graders, and you can see we have 445 fifth graders, and we have even more sixth graders. Those are the big classes. The second column is just a rollover. So assuming no kid leaves and no kid registers, these 403 kindergartners would become 403 first graders. These 418 first graders would become 418 second graders, and so on and so forth. Now we know that never happens. We know kids move into the district. We know kids move out of the district. So what we did was we went back and we looked at, back in 2017, what was McGibbon projecting for the enrollment. And so he was projecting our kindergarten class, and it's currently at 403. He was projecting 392. We're currently at 418 first graders. He was projecting 411. Look at grade 3, he got right on the money. We have 440, he was projecting 440. We have 425 fourth graders, he was projecting 416. So we looked at what had he projected for this year, and what was he projecting for next year? And that leads to the column that's highlighted in yellow, what I'm calling the growth factor, which is what McGibbon was saying. So if you look at his 2021, he thought there would be 392 kindergartners. He thought they would grow to 409. So that cohort has a growth figure of plus 17. He thought there would be 411 first graders, that they would grow to 425. So that growth factor is plus 14. 424 would grow to 438 plus 14, etc. So what we did was said, wait a minute, we actually know our current numbers. So we took our current numbers, and instead of adding this growth factor to the McGibbon projection, we added this growth factor to the actual enrollment right now. So if you look at this column, our projection is the rollover plus the growth factor. So I have 403 kindergartners right now. McGibbon expected that class to increase by 17. So our projection is 420. In first grade, we have 418. He projected a growth factor of 14. So we're going to 432. And then what I did just for some easy math is I rounded the projection up to the nearest 5. So 420, I stayed at 420, 432, I rounded up to 435, 446, I rounded up to 450. So this is just a little bit of rounding. We don't have the same ability to look at kindergarten. So kindergarten, this projection of 400 is based on the average of the last 3 years and looking at the live birth data from 5 years out. So this is what we expect. We don't have nearly that number of students registered right now, but we never do. We get a ton of kindergarten registrations in May, June, July, all the way through August. It is a little bit less than what it would typically be at this point, but we're still believing that 400 is probably an accurate projection. And then we did the same for grades 6 through 12. So here's our current class size. So there's that big 472. Remember we said the top of the elementary was the biggest class. That's a really big class for us to have in the elementary level. We haven't seen numbers like that previously. Here's the rollover. So this 445 comes from the 5th grade on the previous slide. So if 6th graders became 7th and nobody came in and nobody left. Here's what McGibbon had projected for those classes. Here's his growth factor. So he looked at an addition of 9, 18, plus 11, plus 60 seems big, but don't forget that's the leap from 8th to 9th. We tend to get Manan students in 9th grade. We sometimes get private school students who transfer. So that's why that one is so big, because that tends to be a big bump up for us. Interestingly enough, he had projected a loss of 5 students in 10th grade and a loss of 5 students in the 11th grade as we rolled over. So you'll see here, I did the same math as on the previous screen. I did the projection plus the rollover to get the projection for next year, except for these 2 grades with the asterisk. I just felt a little queasy about taking the -5. So instead of taking the -5, I simply did the rollover number. So this is 480, this is 514. He was projecting a slight loss of students. I'm going to keep it at even. And then over here, this last column, as I said before, this is just the rounding up to get it to an even or a 5, just to give us a little bit of wiggle room so we have some perspective as to how big the classes and the cohorts would be. So what does that mean? We spend a lot of time every year talking about elementary sections. So this chart here was the chart that we had happily planned before any of us ever heard of COVID. This was what we would have run this year if indeed we were in regular school and COVID had never happened. So a couple of things I want to point out to you. First of all, we were forecasting, and you see now we have 403 kindergartners, a big kindergarten class. So Bout Hills here in yellow, we've been, since the building project, adding a section each year to Bout Hills until the point at which it would become a 4 deep school. But here in Blue Creek, Forts Ferry, and Latham Ridge, we were bumping them up from their normal 3 sections to 4 deep in kindergarten, because we felt the need for 21 sections of kindergarten with the numbers that were being predicted for us. That's what we would have run this year if we were open. This 4 deep in blue here, this is because the year before there were 4 sections in Blue Creek, so they would go to 4 sections. And in Southgate, you can see for 2 years in a row, we had bumped Southgate up to 4 deep. So they got reduced to 3 just because of the actual number of rooms available in that building. And then over here in green, several years ago, we had a bubble go through, and we needed to make an additional special education room with students who had started at Blue Creek, and we didn't want to move them out of Blue Creek. So they went down to 2 deep and picked up the special education room, and Forts Ferry picked up an extra section of 3rd grade at 4 deep. So that bubble was still going through. We totaled them up as we had every year from you, and we told you we would run 112 sections of K through 6 elementary. That was what we told you in the budget meeting. We never knew there was such a thing since COVID. We thought it was going to be 112. So now I would operate from that to look at what was 21-22, because we've had this planned out over multiple years. So you can see the 4 deep slide down, the 2 and 4 deep slides down the bubble. Bout Hills now has another 4 deep in grade 4 as we work to populate them as a 4 deep building. These Southgate 4 deeps move down. But one thing you'll notice because of physical capacity in rooms is we had returned all of the kindergartens, except for Bout Hills, which is our 4 deep school now, back to their regular number, which is 3 for all buildings except 2 for Loudonville. So we were projecting only 18 sections of kindergarten, down from the previous year where we were projecting 21. Now, this is one of those areas where we've done this in the past, and we're going to recommend this right now again. We don't know how the kindergarten numbers are going to play out. We just don't have that data. So what we would like to do is put a 1.0 kindergarten teacher in the budget that we will hold in reserve. And if the numbers come in the way that we think, we would ask for an extra section of kindergarten, and we would have it budgeted. If they don't come in and they stay low for whatever reason, then we would run the sections we have, and we just wouldn't hire that person, but we would have space in the budget for it. So you can see this is 113 sections. It's 1 section more than what we had the previous year. And that makes sense because we're adding 1 section of Bout Hills every year because of enrollment. So that 113 comes because we are adding a 4 deep. These other numbers have just slid into different grades. So we were projecting all of this pre-pandemic that we would run 112 sections this current year of elementary, 113 next year. Now, the question you might be asking is, how many sections are we actually running of elementary school this year in the socially distanced environment? Because we had to split classes. So here's the interesting piece, folks. We are actually running 184 sections of elementary school this year. We are running 184 sections, and this all happened, the pandemic, post our budget season, post where we had talked to you about very minor staffing. So we had to pivot somehow to go from 112 sections to 184 sections. So what does that look like, just for your edification? These are the total number of sections we have at each grade level. Of those total, this is how many we're running of remote learning sections. So we have 4 kindergarten remote learning sections. We have 4 first grade, 5 second and third, 4 in the 5th, and 5 in 5th, and 5 in 6th. We have 32 remote sections. Therefore, this is the remainder. This is the number of in-person sections we have. So we're running 152 in-person sections when we typically would have run 112, and 32 remote. So how did we cover all those sections and still be able to stay at all within a budget? We, back prior to the pandemic, had started talking about the North Colony teacher force. It was a way for us to work with young graduates, bring them in, assign them permanently to elementary schools, and they were acting as building subs. And it was a way for them to get experience, get to be part of a faculty, get some professional development, build a resume. And it was also helping us because we needed building substitutes because substitute coverage in the region is spotty at best. This year, in working with our teachers union, one of the things that we didn't want to do was have a first grade teacher who had, let's say, 25 kids in her class, have 15 kids in front of her and 10 at home on Zoom, and trying to teach both all day long. We know districts had to do that and we understand. We just thought that would be a very tough learning environment for our littlest ones. To imagine that a teacher is just teaching in front of the camera like I am standing behind my computer right now, but all the kids would be out there past me, the ones present, but I'd have to stay here to see the 10 at home. So we worked with our teachers union, and the teachers force model was saying, okay, if I have to split that kindergarten class, what if I bring in a newly certified teacher who works under the already certified kindergarten teacher and for part of the day has this group of kids? So now both sets of kids, the classroom teacher is planning, the person who knows the curriculum is planning, working with the teacher force partner, helping the partner, but no kid in kindergarten or 1 or 2 is in front of the screen. They're actually working with the teacher force partner. So we ended up using 19 teacher force partners. The other group is, and many of our colleagues had to do this as well, is all of our AAS teachers, remedial reading teachers, remedial math teachers, they are elementary certified teachers. So for the year, we pulled them out of AAS and we put them into classroom teaching positions. And guess what? They're doing a great job for us. So we have 27 remedial teachers who are currently teaching a first grade class, a fourth grade class. Other coverage is in areas where we had to make an extra homeroom section, primarily at the 4 through 6, where we have a building sub who's covering a homeroom because we needed 4 cohorts instead of 3, and there were only 3 teachers. They're not actually teaching the subjects to the kids, but they're covering the homeroom and they're covering the sections. So we have 9 of those. So classroom teachers are regular classroom teachers that we've always had. K through 6 teachers, we have 128 classroom teachers in North Colony who are elementary certified, who are teaching elementary school, 128 of them. So this doesn't include AAS, because our hope would be to return our AAS teachers to their AAS jobs next year. This doesn't include the teacher force because we would hope to have them as building subs again. This is our 128 elementary classroom teachers. So that is the number of full-time equivalent teachers we have who are certified in teaching for us in K-6 classrooms right now. So what we have to look at next is the sections now that we know a little bit better. And so we have the number of kids who are in front of us. This is the class size guideline set by the board. Remember, we're going to K-5 now in our buildings instead of K-6. And this is the projection for the number. We did add, if we have to go to that 4th kindergarten, we would add that to Latham Ridge because Southgate's had 4 deep, Forts Ferry's had 4 deep, all these other buildings have had 4 deep except of course Loudonville. So Latham Ridge would get that section if we need it, bringing it up to 19, potentially 18 depending on where enrollment is. And this is here, so this says 59/3. That means there's 59 kids right now who could potentially be in Blue Creek first grade. So we would run 3 sections because 3 times 25 would give us 75. We can't quite run 2 sections because that would only give us 50. But you see, that is part of where this class would be smaller than another class where we have 70 kids who are also going across 3 sections. That's just where they're zoned. These are our current students. When we get new enrollment in the district, we balance these out if we can, and we have a choice between 2 schools transportation wise, we will always look at where the numbers are. So we will have 18 sections in K-5 at Blue Creek next year, 23 in Bout Hills, because see, they're 4 deep at every grade except 5th, 20 at Forts Ferry, 19 at Latham Ridge, 12 at Loudonville, and 21 at Southgate. For, amazingly, when I did this, a total of 113 sections, which if you remember from a few slides back, that's what we had projected years ago when we were doing our multi-year planning. So our numbers do seem to align with 113. So you might be thinking, well, that's great because you just told us we have 128 teachers and we only need 113. Don't forget, I don't have 6th grade here because they're going to be in the middle school. So here's where we're going to need some additional staffing. We have 128 elementary classroom teachers currently employed. We have 113 projected sections for K-5, and we need 16 sections for 6th grade. So that is 113 plus 16 is 129. 6th grade is projected at 460, so 16 sections is class size of 28.75. That's a big section of 6th grade. This is the cohort, though, that has been big since 4th grade. They have been in classes of this size, except for this year in the pandemic, since they've been in 4th grade. This is the big bubble cohort that's going through. So we need to add 1.0 to our current teacher totals in order to get to 129. And that should make sense to you because in fact, that's the one extra section we're really adding the 4th grade at Bout Hills. So we are proposing that we add this 1.0 to cover that section at Bout Hills and get us to 129, and then have a 1.0 that we're holding depending on where those kindergarten numbers fall. And if we need to pull it, we've at least budgeted for it and we don't have to come back to the board afterward. What that does, however, is that takes all of our elementary teachers. So if we're returning our AIS teachers to the classroom and we're returning teacher force to building substitute positions, we have to see what the requirement is going to be for remote instruction next year. We don't have guidance for reopening next year. You'll remember it came out very late. We were all very frustrated that it didn't come out until the end of July. If we are required to run remote sections, we would do what we had done this year. We would survey our families, see who wanted remote. We would have to see how many sections we would need of remote learning. Each remote teacher, as they did this year, would have a cross section of students. It could be from multiple buildings because there may not be that many 3rd graders just from Southgate. So we might need to say, okay, you're going to have a 3rd grade class that's going to have Southgate and Loudonville and Forts Ferry in it, which is what we're doing this year. So we would like to return our AAS teachers to their AAS positions because we know kids are going to need support. What we would propose is there is federal stimulus money coming. We don't know exactly the parameters of that yet and how it's coming through the state, but we know the stimulus plan was passed. And one of the things you don't want to do is use federal stimulus money for something that you're going to have to put into the general fund next year, because the stimulus money, we don't expect that we're going to get a stimulus package this big every year. So one way that it would make sense is to use the stimulus money to hire 1-year teachers to teach these remote sections, because we have the money for a year and we need the teachers for a year. So in that way, it would work, and that would be, it's an allowable expense for the federal stimulus funding, and it would make sense because it's not something that we're going to say we'd have to incur the following year, because by the following year, the prediction is that students will be vaccinated and we will be able to proceed with more kids in person. We just don't think we're going to be there in September. But please note that this is all conditional. If we really have to wait, and we heard from State Ed that they're waiting to hear from the governor. We know the governor is the one who was giving us the back to school guidelines last year, and we expect the governor will be the one who gives us the back to school guidelines this year. So Joe, I think maybe I'll stop screen sharing because I know it's hard to see if people have hands up, and we could take questions, and then I can reshare for the next section if that's helpful.
Mr. Vondell.
Yeah, so That was a lot of information. Thank you very much. And it was very clear, which I thought I was getting lost there for a minute, but you got me back. So thank you very much for that.
I'm glad.
Are there any questions from board members? Mary, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I do have a question. So we have 27 AIS, no. Hang on just a
Yeah,
second.
you're right, 27.
27 AIS, but I
Yeah.
actually wanted to talk about the 19 teacher force.
Mhm.
Do we normally have 19, like before pandemic, did we have 19 teacher force teachers, or did they come after, we had to change everything around?
We increased the total. So our goal when we changed the title from, we had a support teacher title for a while, and then we had a building sub teacher. And one of the things we were really trying to do, we've had permanent subs very successfully at the secondary level for years, and we just weren't getting them in the elementary level. So we, as a marketing kind of idea, said, let's call it teacher force. Let's make this more enticing, because we know there's a lot of young people graduating and they can't get jobs right away. So we did that pre-pandemic. We had them in place the year before the pandemic as building subs. Our goal across the 6 elementaries was to try to get 2 to possibly 3 in the bigger elementaries. We didn't always get there. And a lot of times what would happen is we'd get a very good teacher force person who was doing a great job in the building. And then maybe somebody in the building went on a leave. And so we would snap them up and put them in a classroom. So there was a lot of fluidity because we were trying to invest in these people. So this is a higher number than what we've had in the past.
So we're going to keep them. That's my question.
We would keep them and divide them across the 6 elementary buildings, and then as well as the 6, 7, 8 building for covering, because they are elementary certified for our 6th grade students.
Okay. My other question is about the remote. If we had to get remote teachers, are we planning, and I don't even know, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but what if parents or students, especially secondary students, want to continue in remote learning aside from the pandemic? If everybody is, if the pandemic is subsided, are we going to offer that as an option, or is everybody coming back to school if possible?
Mr. Ford, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I would say everybody is coming back to school if possible.
Okay.
Right, that is the
no-
focus.
Okay.
If we have to offer remote school as an option, we will. And then we might consider multiple options. There may be a regional option. So if you had 4 students totally at grade 1 in North Colony, might it be better for us to work with a regional approach through Capital Region BOCES, for example, to meet the needs of those students?
Thank you. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Other questions from board members? Going once, going twice? No, but Ms. Schultz has a question. Okay. Hey, you had your little hand up on the icon there. So I thought maybe, all right, well, if there's no more questions, Trish Vecchio. Yeah, and you're on mute also.
You're muted, Trish.
So I just have a question. I know slide 4, we're operating under the assumption right now, and I know no one has a crystal ball, but we're operating under the assumption that we can go back to 3 feet with masks in place. So my question is, just coming from kind of a logistics point of view, as well as staffing, is if we can only be 3 feet when masks are on. When masks need to come off for things like lunch and snack, how will that affect space requirements as well as staffing? Because they don't all fit at 6 feet apart in a classroom, which would make it so that number of teachers doesn't work. So I'm just curious.
So that's a great question. So it works. You're exactly right, Trish. It works for when you're masked and you're in class and you're learning and we're doing all those things. But what about when masks are off? And that is a big piece. And we talked a little bit about that, like what does lunch look like and how are we going to get all those lunches in and how are we going to get all those spaces in? And that will be a big part of the creative scheduling, and even what mask breaks look like. Maybe kids are better at it, but that is going to be a piece of the puzzle to be determined. Absolutely. That's a very, very good question.
And I
It's
actually
COVID
have, I have one more if it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm trying to just, with the projected numbers, which first of all, that is really amazing that someone has enough like ability to kind of project to that accuracy. But I do have a question. I know this year we had a lot of students who were new enrollments to our district, and they didn't go to schools that necessarily would be considered their assigned school, just due to space requirements. When those numbers are projected, is it assumed that those students are staying in the buildings they were assigned to, they're returning to their home school and options being given, and also our remote students, are they figured into those numbers if they return?
So remote students are figured into those numbers. Yeah. So we figured like if every remote student came back, right? So those are figured in. With the building placements, we honor usually where you start is where you stay. Now there may be a couple of special circumstances and sometimes we meet, but usually what happens is, oh, I really thought I was going to go to this building and oh, we're sad. And then they go to your building, they meet you, they fall in love with you as a teacher, and then that's where all their friends are and they don't want to go, right? So we try to honor A, that you stay with your sibling, and B, that where you start is where you stay. Now there have been a couple where we've had to make arrangements for very recent arrivals to say, listen, we don't have anything in your home building, but if you want to come in, here's where we can put you, but next year you'll go back. So there are a couple of instances of that, but for the most part, if they started with us in September and they've been a whole year in the building and they've established friends and relationships, we tend to honor that. Great question. Thanks, Trish.
Anyone else?
Yep.
Yeah.
For the 6th grade students, if there's about an average of 29 kids per class, and you have to have at least the 3 feet, is there enough room in all those classes? I'm not really familiar with the middle school for the sizes of the rooms.
Great question. We actually did some layouts and measuring just to make sure, and it can hold up to like 36 kids. So we definitely have enough room.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Troy, did you have a hand up?
Yeah.
I did. So this is less about spacing, but and I know we've talked about lunch in the other budget meetings, but we haven't really touched on it. This year, I know the free lunches are being given out to everyone no matter what. Are we going to be continuing with that next year, or are we going to be switching back to the paid lunch program along with the free lunch program if they're eligible?
Troy, that is such a great question, and you are so knowledgeable. Are you in 9th grade?
Yeah.
It's great. I hope you stay on this committee for all your years in high school. So that is a part of a federal program that came through that said that every student could have it. We don't know where when that's going to sunset. It at first was sunsetting in December, and then they extended it to the end of the school year. If it ends and it goes away, then we would return to our previous practice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Melissa, did you have a question? No? Oh, I'm getting weird pop-up things on my screen. Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. Any others?
All right, I will go back and share the screen again. Make sure I share the right screen. There we go. Okay. So we will now go to new programs. And as Mr. Kaur said with the agenda tonight, we're going to cover the Bridges program and the Director of Social Emotional Learning with an equity lens. And then the middle school innovation is going to be on part 2 Monday night, because we didn't want you to be on with us until 11 o'clock at night. So the number 3 will be covered on Monday. So the Bridges program and the Director of Social Emotional Learning and the innovation spaces we recognize, obviously as a district, that we're constantly balancing our fiscal responsibility and our educational responsibility. And although we're aware that there's federal stimulus money, as I alluded to earlier, we also know that federal stimulus money can't be counted on every year. We know we have a tax cap, which makes it challenging for us in a typical year to raise revenue. We know that state aid has not kept pace with the pace of expenses. So everything we're proposing tonight and Monday night, we have really worked together to say, we believe these are fundamental to the North Colony mission. We believe these are fundamental to the pillars that Mr. Core talks about, which is academic excellence, equity, and social emotional health. So the first thing we want to just bring up before we go into the programs is New York State, right before the pandemic, had published their culturally responsive sustaining framework for schools in the state. And the state, we have been working very hard in this district and doing a lot of training around equity. And the state has been pushing us to also think about equity. And I think it's important for us to really look at these two definitions that come from the state. And that equity is that every student has accesses to the resources and the educational rigor that they need at the right moment, regardless of their race, their gender, their ethnicity, their language, disability, family background, family income. That's what Mr. Core often says is all means all. That what we do for one student, what we make available for all our students. It's foundational to our mission and what we do as a public school. And we think that what we're proposing tonight will help in service of equity. And the other piece that the state has asked us to think about is when we're striving for equity, and we always are, it really asks us to really look deeply at any biases we may have or any inequitable practices we may have in the district that have just been here for a long time, and we've never really looked at them from this angle, because our responsibility is to create an inclusive, multicultural school environment that helps children to discover their talents and supports children, youth, adults from diverse backgrounds. And so we're hoping that these proposals, you'll be able to see the connection to equity. As we get started, we've learned a few lessons from this pandemic, and I suspect we'll learn a few more before we get back to whatever the new normal will be. One is, I'm sure you've heard this, there's been a million stories on the news. The pandemic has intensified equity issues and exacerbated the inequalities, not just in school systems, but in our society, right? We know that there are kids across the nation who just don't have Wi-Fi at all. We are fortunate that we've been able to support our families that needed Wi-Fi, but we know that certain communities have had a far higher death rate than other communities. The pandemic has shown us that. It has also shown us that social emotional wellness and academic learning are absolutely interconnected and interdependent. We have a really strong team of counselors, social workers, psychologists, and we have a really strong team of teachers. And there is a tendency to think teachers teach, they're in the academic vein, counselors counsel, they're in the social emotional vein. But we know, and we've seen in this pandemic, they are incredibly related. We have students in the district, just like every district does, who are struggling tremendously. And it is not necessarily kids who don't have academic ability. We have kids who have tremendous academic ability, but the stress of this pandemic has made it impossible for them to learn or participate at the levels they have previously. We have examples of that in every building in the district. And all of us, the educators, the families, the students, this entire community, we need support in dealing with this whole new education reality. Because next year, you know, if we are fortunate enough to be able to come back, we're going to be bringing back kids who are hybrid, who were used to doing a half day of school. Our high school kids who were getting up, you know, a little bit later and coming to school in the afternoon are now going to come back to school all day. Our remote kids are going to come back in person. There's a lot of people we're going to bring back together and then start and go forward. So how do we return? and we're really proud of thinking about this in the district, and we think this is what we do well. First, we focus on an empowering, equitable, and inclusive vision for schooling and success. That we don't start, if the adults are in a panic about like, oh, the kids are behind, we're going to translate that anxiety to the kids. And that's not going to be beneficial to anybody. So what is it like? We've all gotten through a pandemic, the kids included. So how do we empower them, and how do we bring everybody back to the table in a way that's fair? Some students are going to need more supports than others. And equitable isn't giving everybody the same, it's giving the students the support that they need, and some will need more support than others. We need to support our students, our families, and our staff to be well in order for students to learn effectively. We adults aren't immune to the stress, and this has been a very stressful year for families and students, but it's been a stressful year for our teachers and our staff as well. And we really have to think about curriculum, instruction, assessment, and accountability in meaningful ways that relate to deep learning, transformative ways. Like I said, if we start hitting kids on day one with assessments to say like, you're behind on this, you're behind on that, we're really missing the moment to also see how they're doing and how well they're doing socially and emotionally. We have to have the two of them work together. It doesn't mean we then take the approach of like, oh, these poor kids, we can't teach them anything, because that would be a terrible disservice as well. But I think it's important for us to be mindful that our students, this is from a national news segment, it's very brief, and let me open this up just so I can see, so somebody can give me a thumbs up that the volume is working when we put this up.
Students are facing unprecedented challenges.
We're all really struggling.
Basically, it sucks.
Definitely less interested.
We've been following 16 students since the first day of school, and they echo what was found in our massive national survey.
I've never felt so much stress in one school year.
The study surveyed 75,000 students from 2018 to 2020, and in the fall of 2020 alone, found that over 56% of students said their stress related to school increased compared to the time before coronavirus.
I definitely feel very stressed. I probably get around like 4 to 5 hours of sleep.
Why am I having so many mental breakdowns? In October, we saw that in our student in Chicago. Allegra went from frustration with online glitches.
The whole thing would just like kick me out.
To a near meltdown.
I don't understand. And I can't ask teachers for help.
And looking back now, what was your lowest moment of the school year so far?
It would be that time I cried over my physics project. At that point, I was like, this online is not going to work.
The study also found 41% said their effort toward learning decreased.
My attention definitely decreased.
I'm still surprised at how much online's affecting me.
That was John in Pennsylvania last December. Now he says he's constantly distracted.
I heard snow blowers, dogs barking, parents going in and out, and it really can mess with me.
Another finding, 50% of students said the strength of their relationships with teachers has decreased.
I kind of sent a follow-up email to one of my teachers, kind of just like telling him about everything that's been going on. And it took him almost like 4 days to respond.
Do I believe kids will be okay? And will they make it? Absolutely. Will they be able to do that alone? No.
Learning how to manage.
I'm just trying to think positively.
I'm trying my best.
In a year filled with the unexpected. Rahima Ellis, NBC News.
So although that wasn't from our students, that could have been from our students. As I talk with our teachers, they are seeing our kids struggling as well. And some kids are thriving, but a lot of them, even the ones who are doing well on the surface, are dealing with it. And if we think about ourselves as adults and the ups and downs we've all had, I assume, during the pandemic, but we also have the life experience of X number of years on this planet. We also have the life experience of having coping strategies. And that's different than if you're a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old. So we are really thinking about that we have to be sure that we're reconnecting with them and engaging them in meaningful and important ways so that we can help them through the anxiety and not have them feel this way 2 months into the next school year. So the first program I'm going to talk about today is the Bridges program. And as Mr. Kaur said, Brenna Muldoon, our World Languages Supervisor and our ENL Supervisor, has proposed this program. And Brenna, if you'd like to unmute and talk to everyone about this program, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Ms. Skeels. You know, I think in just seeing the previous slides and listening to what Ms. Skeels shared, you know, there's certainly a lot to think about in how this pandemic has impacted our English language learning population of students. So the new program initiative that I'm going to talk to you about today is called the ENL, which stands for English as a New Language, Bridges to Academic Success program. This program is being proposed for our middle school students, so students in the middle years at the secondary level. And just to provide a little bit of background and some information about our ENL population in the North Colony School District, if you notice on the slide, there is a graph to the right, which shows our ENL population and how it has grown from October 2016 to October 2020. And over those past 5 years, we've seen an almost 40% increase in our overall L population. This increase in overall enrollment has also brought an increase in linguistic and cultural diversity amongst our Ls. Our Ls come from 41 different countries and speak 38 different languages. And if you take a look at the chart on the left that outlines countries where our Ls were born, I know that the labels are kind of small to see, but the largest population are students who were born in the United States, and that's what you see in orange. But then 4% of our students were born in Yemen, 3% in Afghanistan, 4% in India, 3% in Mexico, 6% in Pakistan, and 3% in Sudan. And then 18% represents other countries. And there are actually 31 different countries represented in that other segment. And the reason I point that out is we are seeing in our ENL population more and more students coming to our school district as asylum seekers or refugees. As you can see again from the chart, from places like Afghanistan, Sudan, Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Venezuela, just to name a few. According to the UN Refugee Agency, these are all places where there are humanitarian crises and emergencies right now. Students coming from these places often have interrupted or inconsistent schooling because of the situations they were living in previously. They may have been living in refugee camps, living in hiding, living a transient life on their journey to the United States, where they may have had to travel to several different countries. They may have not been able to attend school every day. They may have not been able to afford school in countries where there is no free public schooling available, or their school day may have been shorter. So those are all different examples of what could potentially constitute interrupted or inconsistent schooling. What we have been noticing and seeing as this population continues to grow is that the current programming that we offer does not quite meet the needs of these students who often have low literacy levels in their home languages. These students are typically placed in our current mainstream classes where basic literacy skills are not the focus of instruction, especially at our secondary levels when students enter middle school. These students often struggle to understand and access the curriculum as it's delivered, and as a result, often have failing grades. According to the 2018-19 English Language Learner, Multilingual Learner data report from the New York State Department of Education, approximately 30% of English language learners drop out statewide. Targeted early literacy development is known to be a key factor in increasing graduation rates and also student academic success. What I have written out here on the slides is a description of what the program is and how it's designed. So it is a program that is designed specifically for secondary students who fit the criteria that I already described. It's a high interest and age appropriate curriculum designed for newcomer English language learners. Part of the issue that we often see is that books and materials that are written at a literacy level that these students could access are often books that are targeted for elementary age students. It's difficult to put books like that in the hands of secondary teenagers, you know, who would prefer to be reading something that is more of interest to them, and also, you know, that they would not be embarrassed to be reading in their classes. So the program, again, it's targeted to students who are new to English, have had interrupted or inconsistent schooling in their home country, and have a literacy level of 2 or more school years below grade level. And again, that's in their native language. The course is designed to narrow the literacy and achievement gap for these students and to ultimately help them transition successfully into a traditional or mainstream English language arts course. Currently, our ENL students, depending on the level of service that they receive, they are enrolled in a mainstream ELA course, and then they have what's referred to as a standalone course. So this program sort of supplants that as a transition program until they're ready to successfully access the curriculum with their peers in their mainstream classes. The program is designed to engage students in rigorous work that is appropriate to their literacy level. And another, something else that we often see, especially, I mean, many of our immigrant students, but also students coming from places where they may have had inconsistent schooling, is helping them acclimate to an American school, but also to school in general. Some students that come, they are what is referred to as new to print. So they may have never had a book. They may have never read written language or seen written language. So this program really targets all of those various needs. The program has had tremendous success in schools all over New York State. Locally, it's been used in the Albany International School in their Newcomer Academy. It was also used at Niskayuna and in East Greenbush. Statewide, it's used in many of the city school districts, New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, and the Brentwood Union Free School District. In looking at samples of student work, students who have gone through this program, students arriving who may have been new to print and may have not been able to even write a complete sentence, by the end of just a couple of months in the program, have shown so much progress that they're able to write full and complex sentences and paragraph length writing pieces. So tremendous growth in a very short amount of time. Students come to the program, as I said, sometimes with no previous exposure to any type of written language before. So it really helps, again, target those foundational literacy skills that would not be targeted in a mainstream course with native English speakers in the class. So again, I think this program has shown tremendous impact on students who fall in this demographic. In order to start the program, to get it off the ground and get it going in our middle school program, we would be looking at the need to purchase some curriculum materials and resources that go along with the program. Those would include a class set of texts, reading level assessments that help the teachers assess the students' current reading levels and monitor their progress throughout the program, and book bins of leveled independent reading texts, which would create a classroom library, again, of those high interest, easily accessible texts for students as they're developing those literacy skills. And the approximate cost of those resources is about $5,000. In addition, we would be adding a section of ENL into our middle school program, which would be an additional 0.2 FTE. So I think that encapsulates what I wanted to share. And I suppose if anybody has any questions, we can open it up.
Thank you, Brenna.
Mrs. Nardolillo, sorry. You are muted.
I'm sorry. Again, I thought I clicked that button before I started yapping. So if this is early literacy development that we should be focusing on, is this like a pilot program that we will eventually try to expand into the elementary schools?
So the program as it's designed is targeted to secondary students.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the rationale behind that is because of the drastic dropout rate for ELs, and because those early literacy skills tend to not be part of the curriculum at the secondary level, where students in the elementary program have a better chance of getting that exposure in their classrooms with their peers. So I think the hope would be that potentially expanding the program up into the higher grades.
And Brenna,
So that's how the program is designed.
one of the key points in the program, from what I understand, is that the absent this program is that the materials that are available that are accessible to adolescent ELL learners are those programs could be, very basic, too young, a source of embarrassment for those students. So the opportunities for success based on interest and engagement is significantly more as a result of that program. Isn't that the premise of the program?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I don't have a question. I would just say that it looks like an excellent investment of funds to me.
Absolutely.
I mean, really. So you've convinced me.
So I was curious about how many kids in the middle school would be affected by this?
Yep. So it is a smaller population of students. So the class size would probably not exceed 10 students. But again, I think what we're seeing is, we have students currently in our schools, in our programs, and we don't really have an appropriate place to put them. And so people in the district are working very, very hard to come up with creative solutions and try to come up with patchwork solutions, but this would be more of a sort of systemic program where kids could go, so that they would, again, the idea, the philosophy behind the program is that students they're not intended to be in the program for extended periods of time. It's really meant to be a year or two, and then they exit out of this and attend all mainstream classes with their peers.
I was just concerned that 0.2 FTE might not be enough to do what you needed to do. That's why I was asking how many students, and would they all be coming in together all at the same time? Is that, you designate that in the whole building, or how would that work?
So I guess it depends on year to year. We would develop a recommendation system for students to be in this program, and the state, New York State. So the Bridges program is actually a sort of a grant program of New York State. It's a New York State approved curriculum, and they have designed an assessment that's called the Multilingual Literacy Screener. And that screener is actually available at this moment, I want to say at least 10 languages. And students can take that screener, and they take the screener again in their home language. And that screener gives reports about the student's literacy level, and where they are based on their level of vocabulary, their level of reading comprehension. And again, as I said, like those tests are done in their native languages. So, again, these kids, there's multi layers, right? They're learning our culture in the United States, they're learning school culture, they're learning English, but then also developing literacy. So it's different from, you know, other students in our ENL population who have maybe been in school in their home country until 6th grade. And then they come here, they have all of those, you know, literacy skills already, and they can transfer those from their native languages to English. So it is a smaller population of kids that this would target, but again, the results are so powerful. I think it would be an incredible support, and especially after this year of pandemic. In addition, yeah.
I did have a question, but Ms. Muldoon might have just answered it. It was about the assessment of being 2 grades behind in their native language. I was curious about how that's determined, and is that an entrance criteria to the program, or is that just sort of anecdotal that, you know, especially if you're only able to test in 10 languages, how do you know who's eligible?
Yeah, so a lot of data can be taken into account. It can also, so that is kind of one data point that can be used, the screener. We actually had a couple of years ago a student we administered the screener to, and the screener was not available in their home language. So we were able to get the English version and have the screener translated by one of our translators. So that was kind of one way we sort of tried to work around that. The Bridges curriculum organization is always also asking for when there is a need, you know, to let them know, because they're always developing and adding languages onto that list. But there are other measures that could be taken into account. For example, with our ENL students this year, one of New York State's requirements in the absence of the NYSA slot was that we administer progress monitoring. So we administered the first part of the progress monitoring to our Ls this winter, and we can use the data from the progress monitoring. And in a typical year when we would have other measures of growth and other things in place, those are all pieces that can be taken into account, as well as writing samples and recommendations from teachers.
Well, I'll just say it sounds like a very good, impactful, potentially impactful program for kids. So yeah, that sounds good.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Any other questions? Anyone? Bueller? All right, well, thank you. It does sound like a great program.
Thank you, Brenna. Okay, so we will continue on. And so the next proposal that we would like to talk with you about is the Director of Social Emotional Learning with a focus on equity. So first, we know that we've all heard the phrase social emotional learning before, but what is it? It is actually also something that is defined by state ed. And so state ed defines it as life skills that support people in experiencing, managing, and expressing emotions meaningfully, making sound decisions, and fostering rewarding interpersonal relationships. Obviously, you know that in our mission statement, it says that we contribute to the academic and social emotional growth of our students. And certainly this is what we do year in and year out, helping students from the youngest ages to understand how to deal with their emotions, to making sure they're making good decisions as they get older. There are 5 key competencies. One is self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. However, the piece that comes in about equity is there are barriers that prevent marginalized youth from developing social emotional competencies. And there's a lot of research right now that says you can't really talk about social emotional learning without also talking about equity and social justice. And so we really want to think about our social emotional learning in that larger context so that our students are ready to graduate as global citizens, because we know the world, as Brenna just presented, is getting smaller. We work with students from all over the world, and they will work with colleagues from all over the world when they graduate from high school, as they have peers right now. So this is just a visual of it, and you can see social emotional learning, and it is supported by classroom instruction and classroom climate. There is a state benchmark of social emotional learning that should be covered each year. It's also supported by a school-wide culture, by partnerships and opportunities outside of the greater school, so that this is a whole community effort to make sure that we are graduating healthy young citizens. And this part here came from the Economic Policy Institute. They put out a position paper in September 2020 thinking about reopening schools. And they talked about relief being needed so schools could have resources. They talked about recovery, which was providing extra investment to help students in schools make up lost ground. And that is the Recovery Act, right? We talked about the federal stimulus dollars coming. But relief and recovery are really, let's face it, outside of our control. Rebuilding is the piece that's inside our control. And this is the Economic Policy Institute. So these are not educators, but saying in order for us to come out of the pandemic in a healthy way as learners, but also as citizens in terms of economics as well, is to really think about the whole system and look at the whole child and balancing the cognitive needs with the social emotional needs, and ensuring that all children have access to the conditions and resources that enhance learning and development. And some students need less, some students need more, and that's where the equity piece comes in. We have a new Secretary of Education at the federal level, Miguel Cardona, and he actually just this morning spoke on this topic very briefly, but I thought the timing was important for you to hear.
Can we wrap up by talking about kids' mental health? It is such a big deal. We've been talking about the sky-high rates of depression, the high rates of suicide. I mean, even on our show, we do like a whole segment, and it's called Kids Under Pressure. That's how much focus we're putting on it. So how much focus is the government going to put on that kind of mental health care? Not the same as it was last year. This is a whole new deal happening right now.
Recognize the emotional impact this had on our students, and we need to be prepared when we reopen schools to ensure that social emotional supports are a bigger part of the whole experience, not just this spring, but moving forward. We really need to think about how social emotional learning and that mental health support that our students need is the foundation of the programs that we provide and the schools that we serve, use to serve our students.
Sure. Secretary Cardona, you've got a big job ahead of you. We wish you all the best. We'd love to have Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if I don't close out of that video, we're going to hear the next video. So although brief, again, this push is coming to us from the state, from the federal level, and it's important for us as educators to be mindful of it. So I mentioned some of the barriers, right? That some kids don't have access to social emotional. What are some of those potential barriers? Part of it can be growing up in poverty. Part of it can be exclusionary discipline practices and policies in school. If you are the kid who is consistently sent out of class, if you're the kid who's consistently suspended, it's hard to learn, it's hard to have good self-esteem. A lack of trauma-informed practices in school of teachers have not been trained in this for the most part. I know I certainly wasn't. And anxiety and depression can show up in all different kinds of ways. Sometimes it can look like misbehavior, and it has nothing to do with misbehavior. It has to do with cortisol in the brain and the amount of stress a student can be under and the way they're able to control and regulate their emotions. It can be implicit bias in school staff. We know we all have biases. And this year in particular, it can be educator stress and burnout. This has been a challenging year for family students, but it's been a challenging year for teachers. So for teachers to think like, oh my gosh, this is just another thing I have to manage. I'm trying to manage my own children and these children. This can feel very overwhelming. Deficit-based ideologies, that's that sense of like, oh, these kids have lost so much. Oh, they're so far behind. really, we're the ones that set the standard for what's on time. You saw our state, New York State Education Department say, we're not going to do Regents exams this year. Now, the federal government obviously disagreed, and the state is still fighting that, saying this is not the time. So the messages we are getting are really about not just defining success as academics. It's success for some of our kids to get back in the door. Because when we think about safety, we don't think twice, like, yes, we need PPE. Yes, we need clean products. Yes, we need all these things. But there's also a psychological safety that we need to have for kids. Some of our kids who haven't been out, haven't been in big groups, this might be a big hurdle for them to get over. And a lack of equity. We have some families who have thankfully barely been touched by the pandemic. We have other kids who have lost family members. We have other kids whose family has fallen on hard economic times. So our kids always look different every September from one another, but the gaps are greater because, as we said earlier, everything's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So how do we overcome it? We overcome it by the racial and socioeconomic integration initiatives we've been doing. Yes.
The PowerPoint is not projecting.
Oh, I jumped too fast. Thank you for telling me that. That would be helpful if I reshared my screen, wouldn't it? Thanks, Mr. Core. Let's try it again. Is it there now?
It is.
Yep. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Core. Oh, it's got to load for a second. Sorry. So those were the barriers I just spoke of. So how do we overcome them? We have been working. We have had, you know, that we now have food pantries. You know that we have met kids' needs during this pandemic by delivering food to their families. We have gotten them Chromebooks. We have gotten them Wi-Fi hotspots. We've also been working on racial justice, that everybody who comes to North Colony belongs in North Colony. They are welcomed warmly for who they are, and they come to school and they have every right to show up as their most authentic selves. We have talked about restorative justice practices for school discipline, which means we hold kids accountable, but we also teach them, right? That's what school is about. If they don't know how to do something in math class, we teach them. If they have an issue with how they interact with other students, we don't just punish, we also teach them. That's part of the work that we do. That's fundamental to our mission. That we have trauma-informed system interventions. And again, that is new and emerging research. All the brain research has been within the last 10 years. We have many people who work in the district who have not been schooled in this because it wasn't information that was available 10 years ago. That we have culturally competent and equity literate educators. Brenna just shared with you, we have kids from all over the world in this school, and how do we make them feel welcome in our environment? That the programming has to support students and teachers. And then finally, that these social emotional skills, coupled with the mental health supports and restorative practices, are critical for supporting our children, our youth, and the adults as we cope with coming back from the pandemic, the economic crisis, systemic racism, all of the current events that have happened during the pandemic. Kids have been handling on their own, but they haven't forgotten, and they're coming in with that. And we need to be mindful of that. So this is the New York State website, Social Emotional Learning, Essential for Learning, Essential for Life. And this is Linda Darling Hammond, who actually advised President Biden in helping him select an education secretary. And she's out of Stanford. And she says here what I think we all know. We live in a technological world. We all know it. But social emotional intelligence will be just as important to the survival of the human race as technical knowledge and skills. I know we all believe that as educators. And I think we saw the limitations of Zoom. Right? At the beginning of this, I just joked the other day, we all thought like, this is great. We'll have all our meetings over Zoom. And now we're like, oh my God, no, we won't. Like, how do we get in person again? And it's because technology does not fully replace the relationship piece. The state has done a meta-analysis of schools that are faithfully implementing social emotional learning. And in case studies, see that school districts at K-12 have implemented social emotional learning curriculum with crisis supports, have achievement scores that are 11 percentile points higher than students who did not receive it, that there's greater motivation to learn and a deeper commitment to school in the students, better classroom behavior, fewer negative behaviors, and reduced emotional distress. And I think as we think about the pandemic right now, fewer reports of student depression, anxiety, stress, and social withdrawal. And we've been talking about the increasing numbers prior to the pandemic. So there is a lot of information that the state is saying to us about adopting and really being intentional in social emotional learning. So as a result, we are proposing, and we know it's a difficult budget, but we are proposing a director of social emotional learning, which would be a new administrative position. The state guidance says if you have someone in charge of this team, the likelihood that you will have success will be far greater. And I want to give credit to Casey Barden. Casey has been running a mental health team, which includes some of our psychologists, as you would imagine, our counselors and social workers, but it also includes many of our building principals because we're all concerned about the kids. And the thing is, Casey has been keeping on that. They've met several times this year. But one of the things we asked ourselves is, if social emotional learning is actually, and social emotional growth and development is a part of our mission statement, and it is one of the 3 pillars that Mr. Core talks about every year: academic excellence, equity, and social and emotional growth. How do we have this program of 18 counselors, 3 student assistance counselors, 3 social workers? That's 24 right there without the psychologist. That's the size of a small elementary school faculty. We would never have an elementary building without a principal for them to go to. That's the size of a department. We have department supervisors. And yet this piece is a part-time job of many people. Garrett supervises high school counselors. Crystal supervises junior high school counselors. Casey supervises elementary counselors. Casey supervises social workers. So there are all these pieces, but there's not one person integrating all of this work. And the state was coming out with all of these things, the culturally responsive framework I showed you, and the social emotional learning framework right before the pandemic. And boy, do we see the impact now. So we're saying that this person would integrate the work we have been doing. And because we are who we are as an organization, we make this work for kids. And we do it on an individual level. So Stacy Angel is running an incredible food pantry, for example. And this person over here, Lisa, coordinated to get meals delivered, and Denise got bus drivers to get meals delivered. And it's happening as the need arises instead of being proactive. So the first thing we would want this person to do is come in and do a comprehensive needs and resources assessment. I think they're going to be pleasantly surprised at all the resources in North Colony. We have counselors in every elementary building. That doesn't happen everywhere. And look at our core values that we have as a district so that we can integrate social emotional needs with academics. They would coordinate the district's focus on the New York State culturally responsive framework, as well as the New York State social emotional learning framework, in order to help create these emotionally safe environments for all students that embrace their identities, empower them, and reduce stress and anxiety. So this would be in tremendous partnership with building level leadership and the team that Casey has already created. It would just give the team a quarterback. They would align and coordinate our crisis support efforts. Again, different teams working with different people is not the best practice when we're trying to coordinate crisis response. And the most important piece is this person would be an expert who could provide us with the professional development we need related to social emotional learning curriculum, crisis supports, and culturally responsive practices. We would use our annual federal grants. So we have a Title II grant, we have a Title IV grant to decrease, and our external PD, because we would be moving a lot of this in-house. The district has done tremendous work over the last few years in terms of equity. So this person could do a lot of that professional development internally. And so we would decrease that line to fund this position. So what would they do? And once we started working on it, we realized like, this is a big job. So they would oversee the coordination and align basic things. Like I said, the state website has benchmarks for each year that classroom teachers can integrate quite easily, including curriculum and a comprehensive tiered intervention strategy. We have all kinds of academic interventions. If you need support, you might have AIS, you might have a different kind of support. How do we get a tiered system for mental health interventions, to align district school support personnel policies, practices, to coordinate the culturally responsive practices, because you can't tend to students' social emotional needs if they're not feeling supported because of their race or their religion or their sexuality or their family's income. So all of those pieces have to come together. They would help us to look at school and classroom culture and climate and building community and responsive support, because the way we work with students certainly impacts how they want to work with us. And that's going to be really important coming back, and not misunderstanding that a student just doesn't care about school. A student may not be emotionally available. And we may perceive this as a student who should have plenty of support at home. But it's not upon us to judge that and evaluate that and say whether or not they're worthy. We have to really look at each child and say, where is this child and what do they need going forward? This person, as I said, would provide professional development, not just for teachers and other instructional staff, but for the specialized support personnel, the counselors, the social workers, helping everybody to get better, the nurses, and the non-instructional staff who work with our kids in all kinds of important ways, school secretaries, cafeteria staff, safety personnel, transportation, and any partner organizations that they can bring in. The United Way has wanted to partner with us. We've started that partnership. You've heard about that. They want to partner and be more of a and community-based support services, including there's a lot of funding from the federal government right now about wraparound support, summer support, community-based schools, how we help to bring those services to school to have a true community school for families who can't access it. So we would hope this person would help us with that. Working with parent and family engagement. We have a lot of engagement. We have a great booster club. We have a great Friends of Music. There's a great PAC. There's a great budget committee right now. But what about the families who don't engage with us? Not because they don't want to, but maybe their schedules don't allow or their ability to understand the system. How do we make sure that those parents feel every bit as welcome? Because when we say it's an inclusive environment, it's not just for the kids, it's for the families as well. And then they support and mentor and keep this work going moving forward, because we know students can't learn. So why now? I think we all understand why now, but the National Association of School Psychologists said, yes, we've got to worry about academic skills gaps, of course, but we can't get there unless they feel physically and psychologically safe. And that may take weeks or even months, depending on the individuals in our community. And people can experience different stressors at different times. And I think the last three bullets are the ones that when we were reading and thinking about this really hit us, that schools should not rely on individuals to create and implement support plans in a patchwork fashion. And lots of districts had an old position known as the director of guidance. And we don't call our guidance counselors anymore. The state has changed that. They're school counselors. So we wouldn't call this the director of guidance, but I think our guidance counselors, as they used to be known, our counselors as they're known now, would say to you, they have been asking for one person to lead them and support them for a long time. And I think they're really feeling this right now, because we're all going to have to be in this together. We have way more teachers than we have counselors and social workers. So how are we going to share this work? that the district level leadership can ensure this multi-tiered system of supports that address academic, as this is consistently available to all students and adults. We know that there are plenty of families who are seeking support outside the school system, but it's our obligation to make sure that we have support available to everybody inside the school system. And we want to also destigmatize the conversations about emotional wellness. Every year, families take their kids to the doctor to get a checkup, right? They probably get a physical each year, and nobody thinks twice about that. Of course we do that. Why do we do that? To be proactive, to make sure even though they seem healthy, let's make sure everything is healthy. We give them physical checkups. We take them to the dentist to make sure that's fine. We do all those things, but we don't typically do mental health checks until we're seeing a crisis. So the student who is really having behavior problems, or the student who falls off the radar, or the student who fails. And what we've learned over the years, and we've really seen in the pandemic, is there are a lot of kids who've learned to mask the symptoms. And so if we're only responding to the crises, we're not doing anything proactively to check in on all the kids and also give them the skills and strategies that would help them to deal with some of the typical ups and downs of life. From planning for reentry and recovery, again, they're asking us to look at the inequalities and prioritize our resources. And we learned this in the pandemic. Our schools mean a lot to kids. There was a time with Khan Academy and things like that where we're like, brick and mortar schools are going to go out of business. 2 months into remote learning, we're like, no, they're not. Kids wanted to be back in schools. Families wanted their kids back in schools. And it's all that we do. It's that they come for the academics, but they get food, they get counseling, they get supports, they get friends, they get social relationships. And so if we can pair this support for the whole child with the good work we already have in place with academics, we think that'll help our kids come back from this pandemic far more quickly. Because these are the skills, and this goes back to the Economic Policy Institute. This is life, right? These are the life skills that we all need to have because it doesn't always go the way we want. So how they form relationships that are safe and healthy, how they develop these skills, this gives them routine, consistency. And it's important that when we reopen in September, we just don't say like, okay, let's go back to school. And even a year out, that we recognize that even before this crisis, we've been talking to the board about the growing mental health crisis. That's why we were a district that didn't used to have social workers, and now we have 3 of them. But we built these systems, and we keep thinking about this position as the air traffic controller who can see where all the planes are and say, okay, wait, this is the way they need to go in order to be most effective and most efficient. So we can develop academic skills in tandem with social emotional skills. Again, it's not taking on these poor children, we can't possibly teach them. That's, low expectations, and that's not appropriate either. But that we're looking at this holistically, the teachers together with the counselors to nurture the whole child. And that's central to what we do. It's not marginal. So we're hoping to coordinate with this person a comprehensive, cohesive system of support. We will have opportunities for explicit teaching of social emotional skills at every grade level. We'll infuse this into classes. We'll develop programming that affirms students' racial, linguistic, and cultural identities. We were already there at the end of last year. We have done work with McLean Group last summer. We did internal training on anti-racist educators, and they had 4 opportunities for professional work this year if we were back in. One was to look at our hiring practices. We are doing that. The other 3 we were saving until the year was more manageable. They wanted to look at curriculum and instruction. They wanted to look at discipline, and they wanted to look at access and opportunities. So this person could help those teams with that work. And those are teacher-driven teams. Create district-wide opportunities for students to connect with one another. Empowering students as agents of social change. We've seen amazing things our kids have done during this pandemic, and we know the amazing things they can do, and we want to continue to empower them to do that. And to collaborate with these building-based teams to research and develop these age-appropriate restorative practices that help kids when they make mistakes, because they should make mistakes, they're children. And we need to do more than provide a consequence. We really need to help them understand what happened and grow from it. And we're going to end with this last little clip, which I'm now hoping is going to work as well.
You had so much to offer yesterday. You okay?
I'm tired.
So what's going on?
Strong relationships are central to the learning process. What the science of learning and development tells us is that we need to create learning environments which allow for strong long-term relationships for children to become attached to school and to the adults and other children in it.
When children have experiences of closeness and consistency and trust, oxytocin is released. Oxytocin has many, many positive effects on the development of the brain. So when we think about a relationship, we're not just talking about being nice to a child. We're talking about a child having an experience of attunement and trust strong enough to release the hormone oxytocin.
Good morning, Ariella. How you doing today? The purpose of the morning greeting is to connect with them and to just make sure that I'm seeing them as humans. Like, I'm making that relationship with them, making that bond.
I prioritize relationship building because getting to know them is the best part of the job.
When I come in the morning, we usually talk about things that are happening in our community.
We're trying to build caring and respect.
The teacher is trying to understand who I am and my values as a person.
When I have a free 45 minutes or an hour, I think to myself, I could sit down and catch up on grading, or I could go and make connections, whether it's a smile or a joke or a reminder. It validates their presence in the building.
Rock it out in the art room. It starts from so much honesty and transparency with kids. It's really easy to strive to be this like idealized, always ready to go elementary school teacher, and that's not real and that's not human.
When people start talking about other things while I'm still giving directions, it feels frustrating for me and I have to take a breath.
My students connect most with me when they see that I also struggle and I also have challenges. It takes a lot of vulnerability on my part.
Total familiarity. When that student knows that you care about them, when they know that you're a human, let's think about that. Their academic performance in your class is going to be better.
If I'm comfortable around them, then I'm more confident around them, and it's easier to ask questions and things like that.
So when you're looking at this graph, what is it that you think happened?
Some teachers I don't always get along with the best, so then sometimes I'm like, I can't do it, so I'm just not gonna do it. But when I like the teacher, I want to do their work. I'll be like, I can learn this.
You all have done outstanding work.
Emotion and learning are completely connected. If you're in a positive emotional space, if you feel good about yourself, your teacher, that actually opens up the opportunity for more learning.
Good to see.
I'll try to close out of the right thing this time. And so this last graphic actually comes from New York State, and this is actually from the culturally responsive sustaining education practices. And obviously they have the students at the center, and they have teachers and school and district leadership and community members and policy makers. And they have four major pieces: a welcoming and affirming environment, an inclusive curriculum and assessment, ongoing professional learning and support, and high expectations and rigorous instruction. And so our thinking is, although this is part of the culturally responsive, it very much mirrors what New York State is saying for social emotional learning. This position would help us align all of those pieces. And I want to echo something I said earlier. Some of the teachers that you just saw in that video, we have teachers doing the very same thing. We are not in any way saying that teachers aren't doing that. What we're talking about is the bigger system and structure of support and the intentional and teaching of some of these skills that our kids need so desperately. And this person organizing this leadership team to go in this direction. And the reason it's an administrator is this person sits at the table with the building principals. So when we're having discussions and we're making plans and we're brainstorming ideas, that there's someone there who's looking at it with a slightly different lens to be able to help us reflect and say, okay, who's that going to impact? What students are potentially left out? In what ways does this further our academic learning, but in what ways does it do this? So it's that idea of bringing people together so that we can really connect kids to our school, to our content in a very systematic way. And it is that sort of systemic advocacy that we believe has always been a part of North Colony, but in truth, you know, you look at the numbers Brenna shared, we can go back 10 years and our poverty rate was less than 1/3 of what it is now. So what we were doing in individual non-systemic ways before through the good works of individuals, we just have too many more kids in need now. And so we need, and we've been so grateful to have the board support counselors and social workers, but that one overarching person who really, this is what they lead out on, that's the piece that we feel can take the talent that we have and really bring the pieces together for us. So that is why we're proposing, and we thought long and hard about this position, but that leadership of that team could really change so many things related to equity, related to academic excellence, and obviously related to social emotional learning. So thank you, that was a lot. And I'm sorry that I missed the chat saying this slides weren't showing. I apologize for that.
It's all right. Mrs. Painburn.
I have a couple of questions for you. This is very interesting. So back on slide 24, you had a list of who the reports would be to this new director position. And I'm curious about, because I know you guys have always thought through everything, but what about the health teachers? Where do they fit in? And who do they report to currently?
So they report to Dave Statlander and Matt Stein. So
yeah, that's what I thought. We moved them to the PE area. That's right.
But they are a part of this team because they are within health class. That's where New York State put the original mental health curriculum that they mandated a few years back. So they're very aware of what those mental health curriculum pieces are. And it's interesting that the state has them in two pieces. So I would see them as also integral because this is work they're doing in their classes. So as this person leads this mental health team, I think they're also going to be really supportive and also very helpful voices because they do some of this work already as part of the state's mental health standards.
I guess I'm just wondering if that would make in terms of putting all of the resources sort of under the direction of one person, whether the health teachers belong there, but that would be a decision you guys would contemplate. And the other question I had was about the qualifications for this position. What are you thinking of in terms of the minimum qualifications for this?
So ideally, the person has to have a school building leadership or a school district leadership. So an administrative certificate first, that they've gone through that program. And then we are looking, when we would post this, we would look for someone who has a background as counselor, social worker, psychologist who's bringing that field, because that's what we're really looking for. It's not just the organization of it, because you could get a great administrator who could organize the pieces, but that professional development piece is going to be so important. And so there's a ton of resources right now out there for social emotional learning. And let me tell you, the publishers have realized, there's a market for back to school, like we'll get you ready. And that's not just in academics, like here's your skill and drill book. There's a lot of social emotional. So that person's expertise to be able to say, this is a good research-based program versus this is just something that's getting marketed really well would be essential.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Mrs. Harrison.
Just two questions. The executive summary tree, it makes me think that this director that director's responsibilities would be overlapping with some of the responsibilities that are now, far I see, now being held by department supervisors and principals. Am I right on that?
Yes.
And do we see any potential problems with that? I mean, I can't see all of that right now because it's kind of dark in here, but the curriculum instruction part and so tell me, how do you think that's going to play?
I think it's going to be fine because 2 years ago now, Joe? I can't remember. It might be 3. When we brought the McLean group in to train all of our administrators, and we had many of our administrators who participated last year over the summer in our anti-racist educators training. And one of the things that came out of that group was to look at our curriculum and to make sure that it's diverse and to make sure that it's inclusive. So I don't know that 2 years ago, obviously we wouldn't have had the pandemic, but I don't know if 2 or 3 years ago we would have been as ready for it as we are now, because I think we've been slowly building to this. And so that idea of equity and access has been something we've been talking about. So I do think that's another reason to have it as an administrative position, because they're going to sit at the table with fellow administrators.
If I could add, I'm sorry, Linda. If I could
that's okay.
Expand on that, as we've met as a K-12 mental health team, there are several principals that sit on that committee, and we have had that early discussion about, how do we, it's really challenging to fit everything into a building schedule, obviously, but we have had those initial conversations with building leaders to talk about how we set aside blocks of time or infuse social emotional learning into the current instruction, and where does that align and those kind of pieces. So that initial conversation has started, just as another additional comment.
Okay. I guess my other question would be, what's your estimate as to how far the federal grants, those Title II and IV grants, would go in covering the salary of this new director? Do you have any estimate at all?
I do. So we think we're actually going to take a bigger portion of this salary from what we had in consultant fees for external PD and conference fees, because nobody's going to conferences anymore for lots of reasons. So we think about 40% of the salary would be covered by federal grants. We think close to 50% could be covered through reducing external contracts. And then some of it, again, although you don't want to fund a program with the federal stimulus dollars if it's a program that's lasting, but getting it off its feet, it does speak to a lot of the things that they're asking us to look at with learning loss and providing supports for students. So we believe that in this first year, we could do it in a way that it does not have an impact on the general fund.
So the first year, though, it'd be 1 year.
But the federal grant, just not the new stimulus package. So the title grants would continue, the decrease in consulting fees would continue, but the part that we're covering, the 10 to 20% with the new federal stimulus,
that
would go away.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Ms. Albert?
Yes.
I'm not sure if you're a Mrs. or a Miss.
Mrs. Just a quick question. I think that this is a wonderful thing. And I also think it's not just part of the pandemic. I think that social emotionalism has been something for a long time, being heavily involved in PTA and in special education for a long time in the district. Families are always looking for these services, and where you talk about you have the circle and you talk about the community partners and the parent partners, and you have in one of the slides about workshops and parent connection. Can you describe what's envisioned as part of this for the parent and that larger community outreach? Because one of the things that's been a large struggle for things in the community is that there are many services in the community that have been long existing in these things, but that piece of parent education, because sometimes people are seeking it in those crisis moments. How is this program going to provide resource listings and things to parents so that they're aware of them ahead of those crisis moments so that they know? How is that envisioned?
So Mary, I think you said that really well. And I just want to say as an aside, we just had a survey of the high school principal, like qualities you would look for in the high school principal. And it's very interesting that one of the things that came up in that survey from lots of results was people wanted to see the high school as more of a community school, which a community school. So we have a clinic from Northern Rivers in the high school. That has not taken off in completely the way that it would because of the pandemic, obviously, and it had just started before the pandemic. But again, I think we think a lot of, all right, we'll do a parenting program and it will be on vaping. And a lot of the parents who come are like, okay, my kid's already vaping. And like, we're missing the preventative. So the biggest piece that I would say is that idea of starting with parents in kindergarten, of, interviewing the parents before their kids even come through this door. What are your hopes? What are your worries? What are we doing? What do you want for your child? Those kinds of things. And then I think the other big piece is, how do we help parents to see that in this day and age, and I don't want to totally blame social media, but with social media and all the other pressures kids face, this is work that we have to do intentionally every year. Just like you wouldn't forget to bring, like I said earlier, you wouldn't forget to bring your kid to the dentist. Or if they couldn't see, you wouldn't think twice about taking them to go get glasses. If they're struggling, part of this work is also destigmatizing it. And the only way to destigmatize it is to make it a natural part of our day. So you even saw in that video where the teacher said, like, I'm frustrated right now. Like, yep, we're not superhuman either. We just have learned lifelong coping skills as adults. And for kids to see that and say, like, oh, my teacher was frustrated and she took a breath, like she's clearly modeling what could be a coping strategy. So I think that's a big piece of it. And working with the counselors and psychologists who already run some of the night programs, so to start and say, which ones are the most successful? Like, there'll always be a place for like college admission night, right? There's always a place for that. There's always a place for financial awareness night. We're going to run those programs. But where are the other pieces, and how? That's the big piece. How are we reaching out to the families beyond just surveys to say, what is it that you need from us to be more full service? And there are districts all around us that are doing that. There are districts around us who have, evening programs where, food service is providing the meal, and we're providing the meal, and we're providing babysitting, and we're doing this program with you. So I think that's where that person can really lead us. We have districts around us where they've said, okay, here's the thing. We're going to take this extra closet we have, and we're going to get washers and dryers donated. And you can come in and you can use our washers and dryers. If you don't have access to that, we'll do a parent program. We can also have like a laundry facility. I mean, the work that schools are doing around this, and I think because we have so much going for us, I think we forget that those pieces, there are families that could benefit from that tremendously. And that's where I hope that parent could really lead us, because I've seen us do tremendous work and have a great parent presentation lined up, and it's 25 people. So we're not reaching the masses the way we should, Mary. And that's one of our commitments, is how do we get better at that? Casey, I can see you want to say something.
Yeah, Mary, if I could add a couple more points, 2 more points. One, we've thought about this as a K-12 mental health team is right now we have a really solid group of representation K through 12 with social workers, school psychology level. But one of some of the conversation has been, how do we expand that? So, for example, Ms. Pangburn's idea about health teachers, that would be a perfect spot for them to be represented on that committee as well. And we've also talked about trying to get parents on that committee. So we're hearing from a more expansive group there, students on the committee, and also outside agencies so that we really are starting to get as many resources possible on that team. So that's one. And then two, I think a big part of this is the further education. So further educating our teachers and our administrators and our teams means that we really understand the resources that we are out there so that we can point people in the right direction in the time of need. So for one more piece that we've talked about as a mental health team is social workers. Social workers currently in our district have a lot to offer, but if the third grade teacher at Latham Ridge is getting a question from a parent and they're not really sure of how a social worker might be able to help, then that's kind of a missed opportunity in a sense. And then, we have to look elsewhere. But if that education expands and we increase capacity, K-12 and across the district, then we will better serve our students and families in that regard when it comes to help with resources and different strategies and plans to support our kids and families.
And I think, Casey, it's a good example of what you're saying, but it's not a good example in life. So we had several families during the pandemic who were facing eviction. And we know that the governor had put out some things about eviction and that you can't necessarily be evicted, et cetera. However, if you don't know how to work within the system, and if you are a person who might be disadvantaged in one way or another, and you have a landlord is like, nope, you got to get out. What's happening is we're filling those needs. So the kids would come to school and would tell, thank God, a trusted adult, a teacher, and say, my family's getting evicted. And it would depend on if the teacher had the right antenna to be like, wait a minute, isn't there a law against that right now? Like, can that happen? And then that's where we reach out to the social workers to say, wait a minute, how do you support them? How do we connect them with an agency who can advocate for them and say, actually, you can evict them right now? So those kinds of pieces are happening. But again, getting it to be systemic is the goal and the work that we hope we can accomplish. Troy, I see your hand.
So you and Casey, I don't know your last name. I'm sorry. I know you're a teacher.
Close enough. Thank you.
I know you both talked a lot about resources. So would more outside resources be allocated to this position in order to better use it? Or would we be using strictly internal resources?
I think both, because we've already started getting some of those outside agencies in. And I think figuring out how those two pieces align, so that we have this wraparound kind of service, I think that would be our ultimate goal. Great question, Troy.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to add a point to that is being very involved in the parent community and supporting a lot of outside efforts. I can just say that there are wonderful services in our community, many more than just what the school connects with. And I guess that I think that's where my question was more targeted on with the parent education piece, is that like there's New York Connects, there's, New York State Parent to Parent, there's Bright Side Up, there's the Office of Mental Health County Services for single point of access. Mm-hmm. Now, how as a parent am I educated about that? I didn't necessarily come across that as part of the school. I came across that by, really networking on the outside to get that information. So how does the average parent learn about those services in the community so that they're aware of them, not just in the pandemic times, but even in normal times? These are things that all parents should be aware of. And I have yet to find a single directory location. So I love your presentation. I just wanted to give that as feedback, because when you're looking at the parent component, that's the piece that I feel is most needed in our community, is a resource reference where I can type in my community, this is my problem. What is that list of things? And while there is a statewide New York Connects that is trying to do that, it hasn't completely achieved all of that. And if you're designing this position, I'm just thinking from the parent perspective, that's just something I wanted to point out. but I love this. I think it's a great idea.
That's really good feedback. And thank you for clarifying, because I did misunderstand that. And I agreed. We were just talking about that in another way, to talk about earlier today, Casey and I were talking about how sometimes parents stumble onto information for other parents, which is great if you happen to be the parent who stumbles into that, but what if you're not? And how do we make that more of a clearinghouse? So thank you. That's a great suggestion. And yes, Trish put in the chat, could they help to develop a web page? Absolutely, like and a parent web page and a two-way web page. And you know, we learned recently, and I talked with Brenna about, you know, some different software that, you know, we can say it in English, the parent can get it in their language, the parent responds in their language, we get it back in English. So those tools to incorporate more people and make sure we're making the information we have as accessible to as many as possible, I think all becomes a piece of this.
So I have just a small concern as kind of a follow-up to Linda's earlier questions about where the money's coming from. The outside conferences, I know when administrators and teachers go to them, they come back with a renewed excitement and a lot of great ideas for all that. So I understand next year not having a lot of that going on because everybody's going to be dealing with everything else. But subsequent years, I kind of expect that we're going to have to add some of that money back in for that professional development. And it's just a feeling that I have going forward. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I would hate to see them not be able to attend conferences and not get the benefits from that. I think our kids do benefit from that a lot. So that's a minor concern of mine. Probably not for next year. It'll be in subsequent budgets, however.
One of the things I would say as a person who's gone to conferences and certainly had that benefit is, you know, our field, the research will tell you that you don't get a lot of actual change in classroom instructional practice based on a one-day conference. That it's engaging, it's enjoyable, you might get the shot in the arm, you come back, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this new practice, and then 2 days later you're back into your routine. So what we see here is the investment in the embedded, so we can continue to follow up and have the person on site, which ultimately does translate to different kinds of practices. And there's, whether it's instructional coaching, whether it's a model like this, but that idea of embedded practice, the training that we did with Kathleen McLean, the year-long that we did with the teacher cohorts, it was every 2 weeks for a year. And I still talk about at the end of cohort 1, it was a gorgeous day in May when we were done. It was 3 o'clock. It was gorgeous out. And no one left the room when it was over. And people really felt like they were so bonded after having done that intensive work so long as a cohort together. And I have had so many teachers come out of that training saying, single-handedly the best professional development I've had in my career. It's something that we have in when we look at like the Capital District Writing Project. It's that embedded time spent with a cohort of people over time that you grow and develop together. So we would really, not just because of the pandemic, we would like to move away from the one day. They're expensive, and although you do get that temporary shot in the arm of like, oh, that was really exciting, I saw a really cool presenter, the translation into different classroom practice doesn't often stick. I would just share that experience tells me that, research tells me that.
And Ron, I think, you know, I would echo what Kathy just said, essentially that, you know, it's embedded, it's part of the system, it builds upon the work that's being done, it builds upon the work that you're trying to build within the organization, and you move forward. In my aging career, I've become less enamored with those one-shots and you know, really more convinced of the value of building internal capacity and moving it systemically.
All right, well, sounds like a good plan then. Other questions? Anyone?
We did receive one question from the community.
Excellent.
It relates back to staffing. So the question says, assuming the school resumes with what I'll call a normal new structure in the fall, being the K-5 elementary, a 6-8 middle school, and a 9-12 high school, what is the plan for increasing staff for specifically music and art at the middle school? They talk about a fear of not enough staff to accommodate those specific areas.
So that is something that obviously we work through with our department supervisors. So as we look at schedules, section numbers, how many kids, how many teachers, and I know Monday night, Chris, when we get more into staffing, we'll start to talk about some of those additional staffing requests that might be out there. Mrs. Q, I see you're on here. I don't know if you want to respond to that or if you want to wait till Monday.
It probably is better to wait till Monday because I know I have advocated with the district for staffing needs, and I'm not sure I have a response tonight as to how to pull off a miracle. So yeah, I would love to get your thoughts from central office, and I'd be glad to respond to that on Monday. Absolutely.
Thank you. Because Chris will have slides related to that staffing, and so that will be part of the Monday night part 2 of this presentation, I guess.
Okay, perfect.
Were there any unanswered questions from previous budget meetings on that chat, that email address, communications at northcounty.org? No? Okay.
No, everything else has been addressed.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, well, it looks like that's it, unless you guys have some more.
Just like to thank you for the thoughtful questions and consideration. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Mr. Vondell and of course Mrs. Nordalillo. I would also like to thank Ms. Skills. That was an excellent presentation, informative, gives us a lot to think about, indeed. And but we appreciate it. And Brenda, you did a very nice job as well. I hope I'm not leaving anyone out here. Mr. Core, do you want to say anything to conclude?
Yeah, so first of all, we peaked at 37 viewers tonight, so our viewership was up a bit, and that's always good. On March 29th, we will continue with staffing anticipated new programs and initiatives. So this is part 2. Then we break for the April break. We come back. We have a proposed budget review, updated property tax cap, hopefully a state budget that is in concrete. And we have the property tax report card, and we approve our different schedules here. And that's on the 12th. On the 21st of April, the board will formally adopt our budget. We have a public forum on the budget on May 5th. And we have the annual election and budget vote scheduled for Tuesday, May 18th. So again, I want to thank Ms. Skeels, Ms. Muldoon for their excellent presentation, for their thoroughness, their comprehensive overview of the new programs, for the outline of enrollment that puts a great context on everything we do. And I am looking forward to Monday night, the 29th of March, and seeing everybody here again. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Core. I'm going to take a motion from the board to leave the budget committee and adjourn. Mrs. Pangburn, and I'll take a second on that motion. Mrs. Nardalillo, all in favor? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our community reps, and thank you to everyone for being here with us tonight. And thank you to all those who have participated in a virtual sense. We will see you the next time. We'll see you on Monday. Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
Yep.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.